Hey everyone, welcome back to the third Verizon Connect training session. Today's lesson will be focusing on learning the ins and outs of creating and editing recurring jobs. And just to recap, a recurring job is a routine pickup that falls within a courier's schedule. And just an overview of the training program for today, we'll begin by reviewing what we talked about last time in the second recording, in particular, the creation of markers through scenarios. So we'll walk through another simple example of that. And then from that marker that we've created in our test territory, we'll then show you all how to create a recurring job based on that marker through the UI table. And after that, we'll then show you how we can edit any recurring jobs. And we can edit things in recurring jobs such as the pickup windows or the pickup frequency, or even who the courier is that picks up that account. So we'll be showing you all of those distinct abilities to edit. And on top of that, we'll make sure to emphasize the difference between editing a marker and editing a recurring job. And in particular, this relates to how the system updates what's already currently live within dispatch. And by the end of this lesson, you'll see that when we make changes to a marker, they translate immediately with what's already present within dispatch. Whereas when we make edits to a recurring job, whatever scenario was already published in dispatch for the day will not carry over. And that might seem a little confusing right now, but we'll dive deeper into it in the second part of this lesson. And in particular, we'll refer to this flowchart, which will kind of help us visualize and understand the key differences between updating a marker and a recurring job. But we'll start off pretty simply and we'll recap some of the stuff we talked about last time, which is creating a marker. And from there, we'll make a recurring job based off of that info. So when I hop back into Verizon, you'll see that I'm within the Washington test territory. This is already published. This is within dispatch. And this is a test territory that you all have access to, where we've got 5 routes up and running and that you can experiment making on-calls with, and that throughout these recordings we'll be revisiting. So as you can see here in dispatch, I've got something already published for the day. And what I want to do now is I want to add a new marker. So in order for us to do that, we'll need to go into scenarios, and we can find that underneath jobs and routes, and we'll create a test marker that will then build a recurring job off of. So some of this might be old from last video, so sit tight and we'll go through this pretty quickly. And if you want to see the in-depth version of how to do it with things more explained, please refer to the last video. So again, we're making our marker. We can select the date in the future so we don't affect anything currently in dispatch. And in this example, we're just going to look to add a marker that's located at a FedEx. So we'll go to markers here. And from here, we'll go ahead and name our marker ID, which is the unique ID. And we'll say it's WA test. And with the marker name, we want to then include the account name. So we'll say this is the FedEx location. And let me pull up the actual address within Google, and we can start searching that up. And it might take a couple characters before something populates within Verizon, but that's okay. Once we've got the address selected, again, it geocodes for us, and we can add any notes that we want. So we'll go ahead and save it. And we can locate this as well. As you can see here, it populated in my markers table. WA test is what we were looking for, and that's great. So now, again, this is the method that we really want you all to use to create a marker. And we're not done yet. What we'll do is we'll publish this scenario and we'll push that marker data out into our UI. And this brings up a really important point in terms of what we talked about with creating markers versus creating recurring jobs. So when I exit out of this scenario, here's the first thing I want you all to notice. If I exit out of scenarios and I refresh my browser, when I go into dispatch and when I go into markers, you'll see that marker is in the system. So when I search up the account WA test, you'll see that it's in the marker table. But then also when we get into dispatch and we refresh our browser, you'll see if we try to create something like an on-call or whatnot by creating the plus button here, when I search up WA test, that is in dispatch as well. So that brings up an important point. Even though we had published this scenario earlier in the day, when we had added our marker just now, that marker was accessible within dispatch. We didn't have to republish a new scenario or anything like that. That marker was in our database and we were able to search it up in dispatch. And that happens immediately. And as you'll see later on in the lesson here, that's kind of what this diagram is illustrating. So if we say had published our scenario starting at 11 a.m. and we pushed all of that data into dispatch, and that's data that's taking the drivers, the markers, and the recurring jobs, and we published our scenario at 11 a.m. and we have routes up and running in dispatch, any updates we make to markers, whether that be adding a new marker or editing their location, those changes that happen after this 11 a.m. are reflected within dispatch. Whereas when you'll see, when we make an update to the recurring jobs, those changes aren't reflected in dispatch immediately. So then there's some extra steps that you all will need to take in order to make sure if there's any changes that need to be taken into effect, you communicate them with the supervisors or you make that change the day of. So we'll build on this a little bit later, but that was just the first point with markers. When we had created the markers, they're accessible immediately within dispatch. So now that we have our markers in the marker table, again, it's WAE test underneath our marker table, we can now go ahead and create a recurring job. And the nice thing about a recurring job is that we don't need to be within scenarios in order to create a recurring job. We can simply stay in the UI here. So what we want to do next is head underneath jobs and routes and create our recurring job. So I'll go ahead and I'll click into recurring jobs here, and we'll make sure the first thing we do is that we sort the territory to the appropriate one. And in our example, we want to stay in Washington and work through here. So we've got that selected. And the next step that we want to do is create our recurring job using this plus button up here at the very top. And when we create our recurring job, the first thing that you'll want to do is you want to name the recurring job within a particular way. And you want to name it starting with the account number. So in our example, it's WAE test. And you want to follow it with an underscore. And the next two things you want to do are you want to enter in the pickup start window and the pickup end window for the account. And you can do so with military time. So in this example, we'll say that the courier is expected to arrive at this FedEx starting at 3 o'clock. So using military time, we can say 15:00. And we don't need to include the seconds in there at all. So we're okay with this so far. Now that's our start window. And what we then want to do is follow it up with an underscore and then provide the end window for this account. So we can say, perhaps this FedEx location closes at 8 o'clock. And again, we're using military time. And then what you then want to do is follow it up with another underscore. And here is where you would list the days of the weeks where that pickup is expected to happen. Because again, these recurring jobs are routine pickups. So in this example, we'll just go ahead and broadly say it's a Monday through Friday. And when we do that, you can go ahead and type out the abbreviated versions of the weekdays, separated out by a comma. So in this example, we'll go Monday, Tuesday through Friday. And that's it for the name. That is the convention where we would like you all to be naming your recurring jobs. And that does two things. It helps keep our data organized cleanly here. And it also helps the couriers because within Verizon, when the couriers are logging into their application and they have their job menu revealed for the day, they can see the account number as well as the pickup windows. So they'll know if they're picking up their account within the correct windows or if perhaps they're a little bit early. So that's the naming convention to help both sides out. What you'll then want to do next is we want to search up that marker associated with this pickup. So that's why we wanted to go ahead and create our marker first, because our recurring jobs are built off of existing markers. So we needed to get that into the system first. And when we click down in the drop-down menu for location, this is where we can search up the marker name. So in our example, it's the WAE test followed by FedEx. So when I type that in, you can see that populate here. And then now we've got this pickup connected with that marker. So going forward, this pickup will always be pulling from the geographical data associated with that markers, and it will route the couriers to the correct location. The next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to specify the specific pickup. We can say it's a box or we can say it's a live. In this example, we'll go ahead and we'll say live because they close at 8 and they typically don't use the lockbox. So we'll go ahead and say routine live and we'll have that selected. The next thing is you'll see a category for the priority. We typically leave these for as normal for regular customer pickups. And then the next date that's kind of important is the start date. So when is this pickup expected to take place and when is it going to end? So in our example here, we'll just go ahead and we'll leave the end date blank because we don't know that. It's going to be recurring until sales notifies us otherwise. And what's important here is that for your start date, you want to make sure it's set equal to the first date of this pickup. So in this example, this first pickup will occur on a Monday. And so this start date should also fall on a Monday. So right now we've typed out that this is a pickup Monday through Friday with the start date starting this Monday today, which is perfectly fine. What we wouldn't want to do is if this pickup started on a Monday, we would then select a Tuesday start date. We don't want that. We want to make sure that the first day of the week, starting from Monday where this pickup occurs, is the same as the start date, weekday. So now if in this example, let's say it's a Sunday pickup as well, then in that example, we would select a Sunday to make sure we're matching this field. So we'll go back and we'll clear out Sunday and we'll make sure that Monday is selected. And I intentionally selected this date for a reason, because again, remember earlier, we had already published our scenario and we have routes currently running in dispatch. And what you'll see is even though I created this recurring job that is set to begin today, once I finish creating this recurring job, we'll go back into dispatch and you'll see that that recurring job isn't actually pulled into dispatch yet. And we'll show you how you can navigate around that as well. But that pretty much concludes the start date field. What you'll then want to do next is you'll want to scroll down and you'll head to the driver requires field. Now, this is where we connect the pickup with a specific courier through the concept we talked about in our first recording, the driver required tags. Now, every driver who works for us will have a tag that represents their route number, and every routine pickup will have a tag that connects that pickup to the driver. So in this example, we can say of the drivers we have, this pickup will go to WA 101, and that represents the route WA 101. So driver requires is essentially where you want to be putting in the route number for the courier and route that will be servicing this account. So those are the big items you want to be filling out in detail. We've got the name, we're connecting it with our marker through location, we're selecting the appropriate type, and we're making sure that the start date is the same as the first date for the pickup. And then lastly, you'll be connecting the pickup with the courier through the tag in this driver requires field. Now, the next thing you want to do before we save this recurring job is you'll want to go into the frequency tab and make sure that you fill out this information. And what we do recommend is that your base date is the same date as your start date. So again, we're making sure it aligns with that first weekday pickup, which is a Monday. And we'll go ahead and select that as our base date. Next up, what we'll want to do is we'll want to edit this frequency for the pickup. Since this is a Monday through Friday pickup, it is going to be daily, and we'll say that once every day, so we'll make sure to change this from week to day, this pickup will occur. Now, what we can then do is specify the specific weekdays where this pickup will occur. And so in our example, we're going Monday through Friday, and we can make sure then to deselect Saturday and Sunday. And you'll know it's deselected by the lack of blue highlighting when you select on the weekdays. By default, all of the days are selected. So here we've deselected Saturday and Sunday. And the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're filling in the pickup windows. So earlier when we were naming our recurring job, we had set it to be 3 o'clock to 8. And we just want to make sure that the time windows match. Because ultimately, this field is what's going to be populating the courier's jobs and routes, not necessarily the name here. The naming is just to assist the courier. This information will be what's actually routing them. So we'll go ahead and we'll change this accordingly. And we'll scroll down, we'll make sure that we can find the right one, 3 p.m. all the way to 8 p.m. So again, that's within the frequency tab. You want to make sure you're setting your base date equal to your start date. You'll want to make sure you're changing the frequency of the pickup. So in our example, it's occurring daily, and we've changed the field from week to day. We can leave the very target date to be 0 because for these pickups and for most pickups we want to do, they should be occurring that day. Lastly, you want to make sure you're specifying the correct weekdays, making sure that the ones that are having a pickup are blue, and then we're filling out the time windows. The last thing we can do is we can change the time on site by going to the on-site tab. And generally, we've been leaving 5 to 10 minutes for each pickup. And then what we can do is specify any recurring job notes. So in this example, we can say no lockbox, live before 8 p.m. Always check the office. And so then the courier will see this pickup note. And that's it. We've got all the correct columns we need filled out, and we can go ahead and save our recurring job. So now that we've saved it, and we can refresh our browser here, when we search up for the recurring job in this table, we should be seeing it. So I can search it up here at this search bar. And when I just type in WAE test, you can see that that recurring job is now within our recurring jobs table. But now let's go ahead and head back into dispatch and see what happened. So we said that this recurring job should start today and that it should go to courier with the tag WA101. So when we go into dispatch, the first thing we can do now is we can search for that job. So let's just refresh the browser and we'll make sure that our jobs panel is selected at jobs, which is great. And we have all the jobs selected so that we're not missing anything. So now let's go ahead and search for that recurring job that we made. And you'll see that it didn't come through into the system. And that makes sense. If we go back into our flowchart here, and you'll see that for the steps for publishing data into dispatch, it pulls from all of the data that's in those tables. So we have these recurring job tables, we have the marker tables, and we also have our drivers. Now, what happens is when we're going through the steps of publishing our scenario, it's pulling all the data within those tables at that moment when you're deciding to publish. So when we had published earlier at 11 a.m., we pulled all of that data that was relevant and present at 11. As a result, when we added the recurring job just now at around 11:30, that data wasn't what was being pulled from the original publish. As a result, the recurring job is not in dispatch for the day. And we said that that's only for recurring jobs because in the example we went through earlier, we added the marker a little after 11, and that data was able to come in. So that's the key difference between recurring jobs and markers. A marker, whenever you add it or whenever you update it, that information is immediately communicated to dispatch, whereas a recurring job, when you add it or update it, that information isn't communicated to dispatch unless you then publish another scenario and pull from the tables again. So what we can do now is, and what a best practice is, if you were in this situation and you had a recurring job and sales had notified you that the first pickup would be starting that day and you already had dispatch published, what you would want to do is simply just create the job for that day. So I would go in here, I would treat this kind of like an on-call. I would search up my account and I would fill up all of that same information. I can say it's a routine live. We can go to our time windows as well. It's a 10-minute on site. And then we can change the time windows to be exactly what was in that recurring job. And so we can add the data in for this day so that our courier can still service the account here. And we'll save it. And then when I go ahead and search for the job, you'll now see that that job was created. And we then need to assign it to our driver who covers WA 101. So if you needed to get that pickup in that day, you can just create it as an on-call, treat it as an on-call. But then what you would do is you would notify the supervisors to refresh their scenarios going forward in the future because you just created this recurring job that started for this Monday. And that's something that we'll touch on a lot later in a different video about publishing and all the best practices with scenarios. But for now, it's important to know that when you're creating a recurring job or you're editing it, that information isn't directly communicated to dispatch. So you would have to do a couple things. You would talk to supervisors or you would create the on-call for the day. So now let's go ahead and show you all specifically that in action. So we had earlier the account WAE test here, and that was our marker. And we gave it this address here. Now let's go and check in the dispatch real quick onto that account. So we made that job, and when we go ahead and we view it on the map, you'll see that when I hover over the job, it has that exact address, 25605 104th Avenue. And now let's say, hey, we made a mistake. The address is actually at a different location. And going back to our previous video, you can see that when we want to update addresses, we can go into the marker table and we can clear out all of the old information and put the new information. So in this example, the new address is going to be at 105 Washington Avenue. And it's going to be in the city of Kent with the zip code of 98032. And we can save that. And again, going back to that old video, we're not done yet because while we did change the street address, we need to change the latitude and longitude, which is ultimately what the software is routing to. So we go to the map feature, we head back up into shapes, and we click edit here. And we'll go to Google Maps and we'll get the new latitude and longitude values. And we'll clear this out and we'll paste those new values in, making sure that we do get that negative sign as well. And sure enough, when you see the new lat longitude edited in, you can see the movement of the marker. So it was originally here, but with the updated address and the latitude and longitude, it is at this new location. So we'll go ahead and save it and we'll exit out of this map. And when I'm back in the markers table, you'll see this marker moved. And again, any changes and additions we make to markers are immediately reflected in dispatch. So if I head back into dispatch and I refresh my browser, when I search up WAE test, we'll see that new address. So when I viewed it up on the map and I hover over it, sure enough, we see that the address moved to 105 Washington Avenue. So again, that's reiterating another important point. It's the same point we've been trying to hammer. Marker updates are immediate, recurring job updates aren't. So that was a demonstration of that. And what we'll want to do next is, after we had shown you how to create a recurring job, we want to show you how to make any edits and ultimately end a recurring job. So let's use the same example. We'll go to WAE test. And let's say in this example that the customer had notified us that, hey, we have a lockbox now. You can now pick up a little bit later than 8 o'clock. So we can go into the recurring job, we've searched for it, and we can make sure to edit all of the correct information. So we'll start with the name, and we can now say that this pickup is going to be available and ready until 11 p.m. So we'll clear out the old end time, which was 8, and we'll put in the new one, which is 11 p.m. And what we'll then do is make sure we change this time window as well. So going down, I make any changes I need to the time windows. I can make any additions to notes if I want to, and I can save. And again, this information, this update isn't immediately communicated to dispatch. So you would need to notify the regional supervisor of this change, and you would be telling them to refresh their scenarios, and they'll know exactly what you mean by that. And we'll go into that in another video. But let's say now in this example that we know this pickup is going to be ending on a certain date. Let's say this pickup at WAE test has been non-productive for us and that we got approval from sales to switch it to on-call starting next Monday. So that's when we can do the set end date. So here in this example, we'll click into there and we can set an end date for this pickup. We'll click into set end date, and from there we can say that this pickup is expected to end next Monday, and then starting on Monday, it will become an on-call. And as a result, this pickup won't populate on the courier's route anymore, and we can change the job type to on-call box, and we'll save that. So up until this Monday, that pickup would still be occurring, but starting the Monday, it will not happen anymore and it will be switched to on-call. So that is how you would be ending your recurring job should there be any schedule changes. And again, if you're making these updates, make sure to always communicate it to that regional supervisor as well, because they'll have to do some things on their end in terms of updating what's in dispatch and what's present in their scenario. So to recap, what we covered today was we showed you all how we could create a marker through scenarios. That is, with markers, we always want to be creating them using scenarios. On top of that, we showed you that any changes to markers, whether that be creating a new marker or updating the address of an existing marker, those changes that happen are reflected immediately in dispatch. And that ties back with our diagram here. From there, we then showed you all how to create a recurring job, how you can create a recurring job using the recurring job table in the UI. You don't need to go into scenarios to create a recurring job. You can create it here in this table. We showed you the best practices for naming the recurring job and setting the pickup frequency, as well as how to assign it to a courier through tags. And most importantly, we showed you how when you create a recurring job and when you make edits to a recurring job, how that data isn't communicated immediately to dispatch. And you can navigate that through a couple ways, but the best practice is to always communicate with the supervisor that a new recurring job was made or a recurring job was edited. Make sure you communicate that information to your the regional supervisor, who will then update their information in dispatch and in their scenarios. And again, that all ties back to this concept of when we're publishing our scenarios, we're pulling data from the tables at a particular time. And if a recurring job is made after that time where we pulled the data, that data isn't pulled into dispatch. So those are the basics for recurring jobs. What we'll do next in the next training session is we'll go in depth with the driver component of this diagram, and we'll specifically talk about setting driver shifts, shift patterns, tags, and vehicles. And then with those information, we'll then show you all how all of this data is combined together in scenarios and then ultimately pushed out into dispatch. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you in the next recording.